Agent Naomi Carter was used to blending in, but tonight she could feel every set of eyes in the restaurant trailing her. Being an undercover FBI agent came with challenges, but this time it wasn't the criminals she was worried about. It was the uniformed cop marching straight toward her, assumptions already flashing in his eyes. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Agent Naomi Carter adjusted her bracelet, a delicate silver band that passed for a fashionable accessory but hid a sophisticated recording device. She scanned the room from her seat near the back of the luxury restaurant, her eyes sharp despite her outwardly calm demeanor. Her training had taught her to blend in anywhere, but tonight she was more aware than ever of her surroundings. This high-end establishment wasn't just a restaurant. It was a meeting place for the city's elite, and more importantly, a key location in an ongoing investigation into an international money laundering ring. Naomi was deep undercover, her assignment critical. Her target, Leonard Marquez, was a charming businessman with deep ties to illegal operations, laundering money through legitimate businesses like this very restaurant. It was her job to gather evidence discreetly. No mistakes, no exposure. Tonight was supposed to be routine surveillance, but Naomi had the nagging feeling that something was off. The restaurant was packed with well-dressed patrons, all white and seemingly indifferent to her presence. Yet, she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. The subtle discomfort of being the only black woman in a sea of privilege. She shifted slightly in her chair, her fingers brushing the edge of the menu, using it as a prop to appear occupied. A waiter approached, offering her a wine list with a polite but distant smile. She could tell he was trying to be professional, but his discomfort was apparent. Naomi had seen this kind of behavior countless times before. The quick, darting glances, the slight hesitation in tone, as if they were all wondering, why is she here? But she wasn't here to worry about their perceptions. She had a job to do. Her earpiece, hidden beneath her wavy dark hair, buzzed faintly with the voice of her handler. Special Agent Williams. Naomi, stay sharp. Marquez just arrived. He's at the bar. Naomi's eyes flicked over to the bar, where Marquez was already shaking hands with a few of his associates, laughing as if he hadn't a care in the world. She felt a surge of adrenaline. The operation was months in the making, and tonight could be the breakthrough they needed. Suddenly, the mood in the room shifted. Naomi noticed it before she saw the cause. Something in the hushed conversations, the stares of the patrons growing more pronounced. She followed their line of sight to the entrance, where a uniformed police officer walked in. He was tall, imposing, and carried himself with the authority of someone used to being in control. His eyes scanned the room with the intent of a man on a mission, but Naomi sensed it wasn't the restaurant's safety he was interested in. Officer Mark Thompson. She had seen him around before. He was known for his brashness, a cop who believed in his own superiority and wasn't shy about flaunting it. Naomi quickly lowered her gaze, pretending to be engrossed in her menu, hoping he wouldn't notice her. But the sinking feeling in her stomach told her it was too late. His eyes had landed on her, and she could feel him making a beeline in her direction. "Miss," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority as he stopped in front of her table. Naomi looked up, meeting his gaze. She kept her expression neutral, hiding the irritation building inside her. "Yes, officer?" He gave her a once-over, his brow furrowing slightly as if trying to place her. "You mind telling me what you're doing here?" Naomi's pulse quickened, though her face remained calm. "I'm just having dinner." Officer Thompson didn't look convinced. He glanced at her table, noticing the lack of food, and then around the restaurant as if to say, "You don't belong here." His expression hardened. "I'm going to need to see some ID." This was not part of the plan. Naomi's cover as a regular patron was supposed to keep her under the radar, but Thompson's presence was throwing a wrench in the operation. She couldn't risk blowing her cover by refusing, but she also couldn't reveal her true identity. "I'm sorry, but why are you asking for my ID?" Naomi asked, her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. "You seem out of place. I've had a few complaints about you, and I'm just following up." Naomi's jaw tightened. She knew what this was. It wasn't the first time she had been profiled, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The fact that she was a black woman in an upscale restaurant was enough to raise suspicion in the minds of some, but right now, she had to think of the mission. She couldn't afford a scene. Keeping her movements calm, she reached into her purse and pulled out her ID, handing it over without a word. Thompson took it, eyeing her name and picture with suspicion. "Naomi Carter," he muttered, looking at her again. "You don't look like someone who'd be dining here alone. What's really going on?" Before Naomi could respond, she noticed Marquez at the bar glancing in her direction. This was the worst possible time for this confrontation. She couldn't risk drawing more attention. "Officer," she said quietly, "I'm not causing any trouble. I'm just here for dinner. If there's nothing more, I'd appreciate it if you let me finish my meal." Thompson wasn't backing down. "I'm going to need you to come with me for further questioning." Naomi's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. She couldn't break cover. Not yet. "Is that really necessary? I haven't done anything wrong." But Thompson was already motioning for backup, a smirk forming on his face. He was enjoying this, the control he wielded over the situation. In his mind, Naomi was just another black woman who didn't belong in a place like this. Naomi's mind raced. If she didn't do something quickly, this could jeopardize the entire investigation. But as Thompson's backup arrived, and he roughly grabbed her arm, Naomi knew she had no choice but to go along. For now. As she was led out of the restaurant in handcuffs, the murmurs and stares of the patrons followed her. The humiliation stung, but even worse was the knowledge that her mission, so carefully orchestrated, was now hanging by a thread. Outside, as the cool night air hit her face, Naomi kept her eyes forward, already planning her next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Naomi felt the cold metal of the handcuffs dig into her wrists as Officer Thompson secured them tightly, pushing her into the back seat of the squad car. The heavy slam of the car door echoed in the empty street, a reminder of how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. She had been moments away from gathering vital information for the FBI's investigation, and now here she was, treated like a common criminal. Her thoughts raced, but outwardly, she remained calm. She was trained for high-pressure situations. Still, the injustice of the moment made it difficult to suppress her anger. This wasn't just a misstep by a local cop. This was prejudice at its most blatant. She replayed the scene in her head. Thompson had walked into the restaurant, scanned the room, and zeroed in on her almost immediately. No questions about her presence, no genuine curiosity, just assumptions. Assumptions based on the color of her skin. Thompson hadn't wasted any time either, jumping to conclusions without even considering the possibility that she might belong there. It was as if, in his mind, a black woman couldn't possibly be dining in such a high-end establishment for any legitimate reason. The car lurched forward, pulling Naomi from her thoughts. Officer Thompson sat up front, smug and self-assured, his hands gripping the wheel with a certain arrogance that grated on her. His partner, Officer Richards, sat beside him, a silent observer to the entire ordeal. Naomi wondered if Richards shared Thompson's narrow-minded views, or if he was simply too complicit to speak up. Thompson glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes sharp and judgmental. "You got a lot of nerve, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Acting all high and mighty back there. You know you're not fooling anyone. What were you really doing at that restaurant?" Naomi's jaw tightened. She had to be careful. Revealing her true identity now could jeopardize the entire investigation. But playing along with this charade was testing her patience in a way few things ever had. "I was having dinner," she replied, keeping her tone measured. "Is that a crime?" Thompson scoffed, shaking his head as if her response was laughable. "Dinner? In a place like that?" He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "Sure, whatever you say." Naomi felt the heat rise in her chest, but she didn't take the bait. She knew exactly what Thompson was implying, and the underlying racism of his comments wasn't lost on her. She had seen it too many times before. The disbelief that someone like her could possibly belong in spaces typically reserved for the wealthy and powerful. But this time, the stakes were higher. She wasn't just dealing with casual prejudice. She was dealing with a man who was letting his personal biases cloud his professional judgment. Thompson continued to drive, his silence punctuated by occasional glances in the rearview mirror. The tension in the car was palpable, but Naomi remained calm, focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her. The mission had to come first, even if it meant enduring this humiliation for a little while longer. They arrived at the precinct a few minutes later, the bright lights of the building casting long shadows across the pavement. Thompson got out of the car and yanked open the door, roughly pulling Naomi out by her arm. She winced slightly as the cuffs dug deeper into her wrists, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. "Let's go," he muttered, guiding her toward the entrance. His grip on her arm was unnecessarily tight, as though he needed to assert his dominance one last time. As they walked through the station's front doors, the atmosphere changed. Several officers glanced up, their eyes widening slightly as they took in the sight of Naomi in cuffs. She could see the confusion on some of their faces. Whether they recognized her or were simply surprised to see a well-dressed black woman being treated like a criminal, she wasn't sure. Officer Richards walked in behind them, still silent, but Naomi could feel the weight of his unease. It was as though he knew this situation was wrong, but didn't have the courage to challenge Thompson. Naomi made a mental note of his demeanor. Every detail could be useful later. Thompson led her toward the holding area, barely acknowledging the other officers as they passed. He was too focused on maintaining control, his ego swollen from what he clearly thought was a successful arrest. Once they reached the holding cell, he unlocked the handcuffs and roughly shoved Naomi inside, slamming the door behind her. The clang of the bars echoed through the small, dimly lit space. "You stay put," he said, his voice low but laced with satisfaction. "Someone will be in to talk to you shortly." Naomi didn't respond. She simply turned and sat on the metal bench against the wall, her eyes on Thompson the entire time. He stood there for a moment, staring back at her, as if trying to intimidate her further. But Naomi refused to flinch. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the cell. Naomi let out a slow breath, her heart still racing with adrenaline. She glanced at her wrists, the red marks where the cuffs had dug into her skin, and felt a surge of anger. But she couldn't let that anger cloud her judgment. She was still undercover, and the mission wasn't over. There would be time to address what had just happened, but first, she had to focus on getting out of this mess without blowing her cover. Her earpiece buzzed faintly, and Naomi adjusted her hair to listen more clearly. Special Agent Williams' voice crackled through the static. "Naomi, we've got a problem." "No kidding," Naomi muttered under her breath, keeping her voice low so the cameras in the station wouldn't pick up the conversation. "Thompson's out of control. We're working on getting you out of there, but we can't afford to compromise the investigation." Naomi clenched her fists. "I know, I'm playing it cool, but we don't have much time. Marquez saw the whole thing, if he suspects anything. We're already handling it. Just sit tight, this will be over soon." Naomi sighed, leaning back against the cold wall of the cell. She hated feeling powerless, especially when so much was at stake, but she had to trust her team. They wouldn't leave her hanging. Time dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour as Naomi sat in the cell. The sounds of the station drifted in from the hallway. Muffled conversations, the clatter of footsteps, the occasional ring of a phone. She tried to focus, to think about the next steps of the mission, but her thoughts kept circling back to Thompson. His smug attitude, his blatant disregard for her rights, his refusal to see her as anything more than a stereotype. He had no idea who she really was. And when he found out, Naomi knew he'd regret every second of this. But for now, she waited, biding her time. Outside the cell, Thompson paced back and forth, still buzzing from his so-called victory. But Naomi knew the truth. Karma had a way of catching up to people like him. And when it did, it wouldn't be pretty. Naomi's patience wore thin as she sat on the cold metal bench inside the holding cell, her mind racing through the possible outcomes. She had been in tougher situations, but this one felt particularly heavy. The weight of injustice was pressing on her chest as she replayed the events that led her here. The arrest wasn't just an inconvenience or a botched police procedure. This was an outright abuse of power, fueled by Officer Thompson's racial bias. And he had no idea how deeply he had miscalculated. The station was quieter now. and Naomi could hear the occasional buzz of fluorescent lights flickering in the hallway outside her cell. She shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable, but the sterile environment made it impossible. Her wrists still ached from the handcuffs, and her mind kept circling back to the operation. Leonard Marquez had likely seen the entire altercation at the restaurant. If he suspected she was anything more than a regular customer, the investigation could be in jeopardy. And for what? The ego of one arrogant cop. Her earpiece buzzed again. Special Agent Williams' voice crackled through, slightly distorted but clear enough to understand. "Naomi, things are moving fast. You need to stay calm." "I'm calm," she whispered back, careful to avoid drawing attention. "But this situation is spiraling, and Marquez might be on to me." "We've already sent a team to smooth things over at the restaurant," Williams said, his voice a little more urgent now. "As for Thompson, you'll be out of there soon. We've made some calls. This will be handled." Naomi nodded to herself, grateful that her team had her back, but the frustration remained. Sitting in a cell, humiliated and treated like a criminal, wasn't something she could easily shake off, especially when her entire career had been built on upholding justice. This, what Thompson had done to her, was the exact opposite. Outside the holding cell, Naomi heard a burst of commotion, officers talking in hushed, tense tones. She couldn't make out all the words, but she recognized the tension immediately. Something was shifting. She stood up, pacing the small space, hoping that whatever was happening was in her favor. It wasn't long before Officer Thompson appeared again. His usual swagger slightly diminished. He looked rattled, though he tried to maintain his composure. Behind him stood Captain Edwards, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense expression. His eyes scanned the holding area before locking onto Naomi. "Officer Thompson," Captain Edwards said, his voice stern, "can you explain to me why this woman is in a holding cell?" Thompson's expression shifted. He stammered slightly before finding his voice. "She was acting suspicious at the restaurant, sir. I had complaints about her behavior, and I thought it best to bring her in for questioning." Captain Edwards raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Complaints? From who?" Thompson hesitated. "A few patrons. I didn't get names, but I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Captain Edwards' voice grew colder. "You mean to tell me you brought this woman in because she didn't fit your idea of who should be dining at that restaurant?" Thompson's jaw clenched, his defensiveness building. "I had reason to believe she was involved in something illegal. I was just doing my job." Captain Edwards glanced at Naomi, who stood silently behind the bars, her eyes meeting his with a calm intensity. He looked back at Thompson, clearly unimpressed with his explanation. "Officer, do you have any evidence of a crime? Or is this just about your assumptions based on how someone looks?" Thompson's face reddened slightly, his bluster starting to crumble under the captain's scrutiny. "She refused to cooperate." "She didn't refuse anything," a voice from behind them interrupted. Naomi's heart lifted as Special Agent Williams stepped into view, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, and his eyes were hard as they landed on Thompson. The tension in the room shifted immediately. Williams was the type of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His mere presence was enough to convey authority. "Captain Edwards," Williams greeted with a curt nod. "I'm Special Agent Williams. FBI, I believe you've made a serious mistake here." Captain Edwards frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the situation escalating this far. "Special Agent, I apologize for the misunderstanding. We weren't aware of—" Williams cut him off. "Naomi Carter is one of my best agents, and she was on an undercover assignment tonight, an assignment that could be compromised because of your officer's eagerness." Thompson, visibly shaken now, stepped forward. "Sir, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Williams said coldly. "You saw a black woman in an upscale restaurant and assumed she didn't belong. Am I wrong?" Thompson sputtered, trying to defend himself, but the room was already turning against him. Captain Edwards' face darkened, and it was clear he wasn't going to shield Thompson from the fallout. "Special Agent Williams," Edwards said, turning to him, "I'll ensure that this is handled immediately. Officer Thompson's actions will be thoroughly investigated, and we'll make sure Agent Carter is released right away." Williams nodded curtly. "That's the least you can do." Naomi watched as Captain Edwards gestured to one of the other officers to unlock her cell. The clang of the metal door opening was a welcome sound, but the bitterness of the entire situation still clung to her. She stepped out, straightening her posture, refusing to show any signs of the humiliation she had just endured. Thompson avoided her gaze, his previous arrogance completely gone. He knew the depth of his mistake now, and Naomi took a deep breath, reminding herself that this wasn't about her pride. It was about something much bigger, an ongoing pattern of discrimination and profiling that people like Thompson perpetuated, often without consequence. As Naomi stepped past him, Williams caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod. "You okay?" "I will be," Naomi said quietly, "but we've got to move fast. Marquez might be onto us after that scene." "We'll handle it," Williams said, "but first let's get you out of here." As they made their way toward the station's exit, Naomi glanced over her shoulder. Thompson stood there, staring at the ground, his face flushed with shame. He had humiliated her, arrested her for no reason, and tried to assert power over her. But now, the tables had turned, and his career hung in the balance. She could hear snippets of conversation as she walked past. Officers murmuring about Thompson, some shaking their heads, others whispering about what would happen next. The buzz of internal gossip was palpable, and Naomi knew that Thompson's days as an officer were numbered. Karma was already at work. Once they were outside, the cool night air washed over her, and Naomi took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief. Williams gave her a quick pat on the shoulder. "You did good in there," he said. "Didn't feel like it," Naomi replied, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "You kept your cool," Williams said. "That's what matters. You didn't let him get to you." Naomi nodded, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. "He's going to face consequences, right?" Williams gave her a reassuring look. "Thompson's done. He'll face an investigation, and I'm sure he'll be suspended. People like him don't get away with this forever." Naomi exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. It wasn't over yet, but she had won this battle. Now, it was time to get back to what really mattered, the mission. As she and Williams headed toward the black SUV parked at the curb, Naomi couldn't help but feel the weight of the night's events. She had been profiled, humiliated, and arrested by a man who saw her as less than human. But she hadn't let it break her. And in the end, it was Thompson who had lost everything. The cold night air lingered as Naomi and Special Agent Williams entered the black SUV parked outside the police station. Naomi could still feel the tension in her muscles, a lingering reminder of the injustice she'd just faced. Her wrists were sore, marked by the tight handcuffs that had dug into her skin. As the car's engine hummed to life, Naomi leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a brief moment to steady herself. Inside the station, however, karma was beginning to take its course. Officer Thompson paced in the empty hallway, his face flushed and his heart pounding with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He had always considered himself above reproach, the kind of cop who followed his instincts. But today, those very instincts had led him down a dangerous path. The realization that he had just arrested an undercover FBI agent, a woman whose credentials outranked him by miles, was sinking in like a punch to the gut. Captain Edwards stood at the far end of the hallway, speaking quietly with a group of officers. Thompson could tell by the way they glanced at him, their expressions shifting from confusion to judgment. That word was spreading quickly. The station's usual buzz had quieted to a murmur, with officers and staff exchanging whispered conversations, no doubt about the mess Thompson had just created. "Thompson!" Captain Edwards' sharp voice snapped Thompson out of his thoughts. He turned, forcing his legs to move, even though they felt like lead. The captain's eyes bore into him, a mixture of disappointment and frustration etched on his face. Thompson had seen that look before. It was the look superiors gave when they knew someone had crossed a line. "I need you to come with me," Edwards said, his voice curt. He didn't wait for Thompson to respond, turning on his heel and walking toward his office. The walk to the office felt like an eternity. Each step echoed in the hallway, the weight of the situation growing heavier with every stride. Thompson knew this wasn't going to be a simple reprimand. His actions had gone beyond the typical misstep. He had racially profiled an innocent woman, not to mention a federal agent. And now, the fallout was inevitable. Inside Captain Edwards' office, the air was thick with tension. Edwards gestured for Thompson to sit, but the officer remained standing, too restless to settle. His mind raced, scrambling to find a justification, an excuse, anything that might mitigate the damage. But deep down, he knew there was no defense for what he had done. Captain Edwards shut the door behind them and sat down behind his desk, his fingers steepled as he regarded Thompson with an intense stare. The silence stretched for a long moment, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Thompson," Edwards finally began, his voice heavy with frustration, "what in the hell were you thinking?" "I didn't know she was FBI," Thompson stammered, his voice faltering as he spoke. "She didn't." "Didn't what?" Edwards cut him off sharply, his patience wearing thin. "Didn't fit your idea of someone who should be sitting in a nice restaurant?" Thompson opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. The captain's accusation hung in the air, too accurate to deny. Edwards leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Let me be clear. What you did tonight wasn't just a mistake, it was a violation. You racially profiled an innocent woman, arrested her without probable cause, and now the entire precinct is under scrutiny because of you." Thompson's heart sank as the weight of his actions fully hit him. I thought she was suspicious," he muttered weakly, but even to his own ears, it sounded hollow. "You thought she was suspicious because of her race," Edwards said bluntly, his words cutting through the room like a knife. "You didn't even try to assess the situation properly. You just assumed." Thompson shifted uncomfortably, feeling the full force of the captain's condemnation. "I was trying to do my job," he muttered, though he knew it wasn't enough. Edwards shook his head, his disappointment evident. "That's not your job, Thompson. Your job is to protect and serve, to uphold the law fairly, without bias. What you did tonight was driven by prejudice, and now we're all going to pay for it." Thompson clenched his fists at his sides, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He wasn't used to being called out like this, and the sting of the captain's words hit harder than he'd expected. But he couldn't argue with the truth. He had let his assumptions dictate his actions, and now his career was hanging by a thread. "We're launching an internal investigation into your conduct," Edwards continued, his voice stern. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending the outcome. I suggest you start thinking long and hard about your future, Thompson, because after this, it doesn't look good." The words struck Thompson like a blow. Suspended. The realization washed over him, a cold, sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. His mind raced with the implications. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was now in jeopardy. All because of one night, one moment where he had let his biases cloud his judgment. He stood there, unable to speak, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Captain Edwards watched him for a moment longer before dismissing him with a simple wave of his hand. "You're dismissed, Thompson. Turn in your badge and gun before you leave." Thompson's throat tightened as he nodded, his feet moving mechanically toward the door. As he walked down the hallway, officers who had once greeted him with nods of respect now avoided his gaze, their expressions a mix of pity and disdain. The whispers followed him as he turned in his badge and gun, the final act sealing his fate. Outside the station, Thompson stood for a long moment, staring at the night sky. The world felt different now. He was no longer the confident, respected officer he had been just hours before. He was a man who had let prejudice dictate his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, in the SUV, Naomi was silent, her mind still processing the events of the night. Williams drove in silence for a few minutes before finally breaking it. "He'll be dealt with, Naomi. Don't worry." Naomi exhaled, nodding, but the hollow feeling in her chest remained. "It's not about him," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "It's about what he represents. There are so many like him, and this is just one incident." Williams glanced at her, understanding the weight of her words. "I know. But we're making progress, little by little." Naomi looked out the window, watching the city lights blur past. She had faced prejudice her whole life, but tonight had been a stark reminder of how deeply it was ingrained in the system she was trying to protect. The irony wasn't lost on her. She worked every day to uphold the law, but even she wasn't immune to being a victim of the very system she served. "Sometimes it feels like it'll never change," she muttered, more to herself than to Williams. Williams was quiet for a moment before responding. "It will. People like Thompson, they always get what's coming to them. Maybe not right away, but eventually, they do." Naomi nodded, the exhaustion weighing heavy on her. Thompson had faced the consequences of his actions, but this was just one battle in a much larger war. The fight for justice was far from over. As the SUV pulled into the FBI field office, Naomi felt a flicker of determination reignite within her. Tonight had been a setback, but it wasn't the end. She wasn't going to let one racist cop derail her mission or her purpose. She stepped out of the car, her mind already shifting back to the investigation. Karma had caught up with Thompson, but her work wasn't done. Marquez was still out there, and the case was still open. As she walked into the building, her head held high, Naomi knew one thing for certain. No matter how many obstacles she faced, she would keep fighting. And someday, the system she fought to protect would be a system that protected her too. Naomi Carter stood at the entrance of the FBI field office, the night's events weighing heavily on her. The cold air outside contrasted with the warm lights of the building in front of her. Each step she took toward the office felt like shedding layers of frustration and disappointment, but the sting of what had happened still clung to her. Inside, the familiar hum of computers and quiet conversation welcomed her back. Special Agent Williams walked beside her, his usual composed demeanor giving her a sense of grounding. Naomi appreciated Williams' support. He'd been there through the mess tonight, but she knew this fight was larger than what either of them had dealt with in a single evening. "Naomi, I know tonight wasn't easy, but I have to ask." Williams started, keeping his voice low as they walked through the empty hallway. "Are you sure you're ready to continue with the operation? We can pull you out if it's too much. Nobody would blame you for needing a break after what happened." Naomi paused, glancing at Williams. His concern was genuine, but the fire in her chest hadn't burned out. It had only changed shape. Less anger, more focus. She knew what was at stake. The operation against Leonard Marquez was still in play, and if she didn't stay the course, months of hard work could unravel. And more importantly, pulling out now would mean letting the prejudice she had just experienced derail her mission. "I'm ready," Naomi said firmly, her voice unwavering. "We can't let what happened tonight stop us. Marquez is still out there, and he knows something went down. We need to make our next move carefully, or we risk losing everything." Williams nodded, but his eyes searched her face, looking for any signs of hesitation. "You're sure? This isn't just about proving something to anyone, Naomi. You've already shown more than enough strength tonight." Naomi managed a small smile, though the weight of exhaustion tugged at her. "I'm sure. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about doing my job and doing it well. Thompson doesn't get to decide the outcome of this." Williams gave her a tight nod of approval. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning, debrief on the arrest, and figure out how to keep the operation moving without tipping Marquez off." "Get some rest, Naomi. You've earned it." Naomi thanked him and headed for the elevator, the quiet hum of the FBI building fading into the background as she stepped inside. As the doors slid shut, the silence wrapped around her, and for the first time all night, she let herself feel the emotional toll of what had happened. The fear, the frustration, the humiliation, it all settled in her chest like a heavy stone. She replayed the scene in the restaurant over and over again. Thompson's condescending voice, the stares of the patrons, the tight grip of the handcuffs biting into her skin. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about being reminded, once again, that no matter how successful, how professional, or how qualified she was, some people would always see her as less than. The doors opened and Naomi stepped out into the parking lot, the cool air refreshing against her skin. She took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. She was resilient. She had to be. This wasn't the first time she'd faced prejudice, and it likely wouldn't be the last, but she refused to let it define her. As Naomi reached her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Pulling it out, she saw an unknown number flash on the screen. She frowned but answered cautiously. "Hello." The voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Officer Mark Thompson. Agent Carter, he began, his voice hesitant, lacking the arrogance she had heard earlier that night. I know this is unexpected, but I need to talk to you. About tonight. Naomi's grip tightened on her phone, her first instinct telling her to hang up. She wasn't sure what Thompson could possibly have to say that would change anything about what had happened. But curiosity, and something deeper, held her back. Perhaps it was the part of her that always believed in holding people accountable, giving them a chance to explain themselves, for even when they didn't deserve it. Go ahead, Naomi said, her tone flat. There was a long pause on the other end before Thompson finally spoke again. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know what I did was wrong. But I didn't understand how wrong until tonight. When I arrested you, I wasn't thinking. I was just acting on assumptions, and that's on me. Naomi listened silently, her breath steady, but her mind raced. The truth was, it didn't matter to her whether Thompson had an epiphany or whether he was feeling guilty now. The damage was done, and his revelation, while significant for him, didn't erase the harm his actions had caused. I've been suspended, and there's an investigation. But I wanted to tell you myself that I'm sorry, Thompson continued, his voice quieter now, as if he were still processing his own words. I know that doesn't fix what happened, but I'm trying to, I don't know, understand what I've done. Naomi exhaled slowly, her thoughts collected. She didn't owe him anything, but she was a firm believer in people owning up to their mistakes, in taking accountability. She wasn't going to pretend his apology made everything better, but she appreciated the fact that he had come to her, even if it was too little, too late. Officer Thompson, she began, keeping her voice calm but firm. What happened tonight wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a bigger issue, one that people like me deal with every day. I appreciate that you've realized what you did was wrong, but it doesn't change the fact that you abused your authority and acted on your own prejudice. Thompson was silent for a moment, and Naomi could almost hear the gears turning in his head. I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I'm going to do better. I'm going to face whatever comes from this. Naomi nodded to herself, though she knew this conversation wouldn't make much of a difference in her life. It wasn't about Thompson's redemption. It was about the broader system that allowed people like him to continue thinking the way he had. I hope you do, Naomi replied simply. But understand that your actions have consequences, and it's not enough to just feel bad about it. Change comes from what you do next. Thompson murmured his agreement. Then, after an awkward silence, he ended the call. Naomi slipped her phone back into her pocket, feeling a strange sense of closure. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was simply acknowledgement. Thompson's acknowledgement of his wrongs, and her acknowledgement of the fight that was still ahead of her. As Naomi drove home, the city lights flickering past her, she thought about the countless others who had experienced what she had tonight, but without the platform or power to push back. She was lucky. She had her badge, her career, and her connections to protect her. But what about those who didn't? The road ahead was long. The system wasn't going to change overnight, but Naomi wasn't alone in this fight, and she wasn't backing down. When she finally reached home, she parked and sat in the car for a moment, breathing in the quiet. The night was over, but the battle for justice, real, lasting justice, was far from done. Naomi Carter was resilient. She had to be. And tomorrow, she'd continue the work she had always been destined to do. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.